This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. What role does God play in elections? Political scientist David O'Connell has some surprising findings, or maybe not so surprising. Antitrust expert Sandeep Vaheesan explains how our economic system has fallen into the hands of monopolists, and it isn't only Republicans to blame. And Bill Press talks with Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The voters speak every 2 years, and some politicians say God speaks on the same timetable, to them or to the public. Professor David O'Connell has evidence that when presidents, at least, invoke religion to change public opinion, the higher authority turns out to be the voters themselves. And we say hello to David O'Connell, assistant professor of political science at Dickinson College. His research interests include the presidency, religion and politics, and American political development. His first book, God Wills It, Presidents and the Political Use of Religion, will be published this fall. David O'Connell, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Presidents from Washington through the incumbent have used religion and God in many of their speeches. But does relying on God change public opinion on an issue when he or she is invoked?
Well, my argument through the book that I'm publishing is actually no. And if appeals to God do have an effect on public opinion, I'd even argue that it's more likely a negative one than a positive one. So in the book, what I'm doing is I'm analyzing those instances when presidents have made repeated religious justifications for their policies. And these cases all suggest that religious rhetoric is of little use to a goal-oriented president. So to give you an example, in one chapter, I tracked the religious arguments that President Ford made justifying his pardon of President Nixon for all Watergate-related criminal activity. Ford talked about how if he personally wanted mercy from God, then he needed to be first willing to offer mercy himself. He also consistently framed the pardon as being a matter between his conscience and God. At one point, he even explicitly said that the laws of God were more important than the Constitution. This language didn't make the pardon any more popular, though. Polls show that the public opposed the pardon, depending on the survey, by a margin of roughly 60 to 35%. And on top of that, Ford's personal approval fell over 20 points in the aftermath of the decision. And you can arguably say that he lost the 1976 election because of it. 7% of people said that they voted against Ford in 76 because of the pardon. In an election, he only lost by 2 points. And I think this pattern is repeated in every chapter of my study. And then even if opinion does happen to favor the president, it would be difficult to attribute that to his religious rhetoric. So if you look at something like Lyndon Johnson and civil rights, Johnson made a stunning amount of religious arguments for the Civil Rights Act. He warned of God's wrath over segregation. He would cite the Golden Rule. He repeatedly used Kennedy as a religious martyr and so on. And by the time the Civil Rights Act passed, national opinion was in favor of integration. But you really can't attribute that to Johnson relying on religious rhetoric in his speeches. If you look closely at public opinion on integration, you instead see a long-term, decades-long movement towards greater acceptance, where support for integration was in the 30th percentile in the 1940s to the 70th percentile by the 1970s. So it's not as if Johnson suddenly convinced people that intolerance was wrong. On those kind of issues, an individual's opinions are not that changeable. It takes a longer term process for that to occur.
Mm-hmm. And your findings were even somewhat of a surprise to you, were they not? Especially the experiment you describe in the last chapter?
Yeah, I definitely was surprised by the findings because I think the conventional wisdom is probably that presidents can influence the public through religion. After all, America is an extraordinarily religious country, especially compared to Western Europe. Gallup polls, over 90% of Americans report believing in God, and then we also see higher rates of church attendance, higher rates of Bible study, higher rates of prayer, and so on. I think the experiment that you mentioned might have been the most surprising of all. So what I did there is actually pretty simple. There were 3 groups of participants. First group of participants would read a religious speech on a political issue and then immediately be asked their opinion on that specific issue. So, for instance, a participant would read a religious argument saying that we needed to protect the environment, and then they would be asked how important do they feel it is to protect the environment. All of those religious arguments mimic the types of claims presidents had actually made throughout history. The second group of participants would read a secular speech and then be asked the same opinion question. The third group would just be asked the opinion questions and not read any speeches at all. So in the most basic analysis, what I was looking to see is if someone read a religious speech for, say, environmental protection, did they then express higher support for environmental protection than someone who didn't read any speech at all? And I didn't find any difference between the groups. So I think that experiment is a strong piece of empirical evidence that religious rhetoric is not persuasive to people.
We're speaking with David O'Connell, assistant professor of political science at Dickinson College and author. His first book, forthcoming, God Wills It, Presidents and the Political Use of Religion, coming out in the fall. You describe two different ways presidents use religion in their speeches. What are they?
Right. So the first I would label communitarian religious rhetoric. These are the kind of nondescript, bland, contentless religious statements that all presidents use as a means of reminding the country of its shared heritage. So you can think about something like a Thanksgiving Day address where the president talks generally about the role of God in American history. Second type of religious rhetoric is the more interesting type as far as I'm concerned. It's the type that I focus the book on. I label that kind coalitional religious rhetoric. So these are the instances where presidents make strong religious arguments for an explicit political goal. Often this language is sectarian and highly divisive. An example of this would be Reagan saying the scriptures are on our side in this, and then pointing to a passage in the Gospel of Luke as justification for his defense budgets. What I wanted to know in writing this book was if this second type of religious rhetoric, this coalitional religious rhetoric, worked. And as I'm saying, the evidence says that it doesn't.
If religious appeals don't work that well, why do presidents keep going there?
That's an interesting question that people often ask, but a lot of other research has shown that non-religious appeals don't really work either. So studies have shown that presidents as gifted speakers as Reagan and Clinton, unable to move opinion on just about every part of their agenda, no matter what kinds of arguments they made. And so the question for me is really, why does any president think they can sell the public on what they want to accomplish when there's so much evidence out there that they can't? And it's not just academic evidence, of course. The president today could look to something like Clinton's failed health care reform and see it as a clear lesson about what happens when you believe you can make an unpopular idea popular. What I think is happening here is that presidents sincerely believe in their powers of persuasion. They believe to some measure that they were elected because they made convincing arguments to the public about why they were the right man for the job. Now, that isn't strictly true, since presidential elections have a lot more to do with fundamental factors like the state of the economy and the incumbent's presidential approval than they do with the actions of the candidates themselves. But nonetheless, that's how these elections are being interpreted. So presidents believe, based on their interpretations of their experience, that they can convince people by their words, so they then turn to speeches, religious speeches sometimes, as a legislative tactic more than they should. I also think religious rhetoric is especially appealing because it's such a large part of our culture. I make this point in the book that even if an individual is not personally religious, they're exposed to religious themes naturally over the course of their lives, through the songs of Prince, Madonna, Kanye West, through TV shows like Lost or Star Trek, films like The Da Vinci Code, and things like that. So I think to an extent it's natural to rely on this common basis of understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's everywhere. That's in the samples that you put out there are. It's funny, you never really think of it that way, but when you think of some of those names in religion, but that's the case. What were some of the big issues that Ford, Carter, Reagan, Clinton used religion in their speeches?
Sure. Well, as I said, Ford used religious rhetoric as part of his campaign to build support for his decision to pardon Richard Nixon for all Watergate-related criminal activity. Carter used religious rhetoric in support of his energy environmental policies, windfall profits tax on oil, synthetic fuel development and energy mobilization board, and so on. Reagan used religious rhetoric in support of his defense budgets. And Clinton used religious rhetoric as part of his attempt to survive the Monica Lewinsky scandal, right? His famous admission, "I have sinned," at the White House prayer breakfast in September 1998, and things like that.
We're speaking with David O'Connell, assistant professor of political science at Dickinson College, and his first book coming out this fall, God Wills It, Presidents and the Political Use of Religion. Carter's most remarkable speech is something you call a Jeremiad, which I'll have you explain the term, and also, was that Malaise speech as bad as historians generally claim?
Yeah, so Jeremiah is a speech inspired by an old form of Puritan sermon. When difficulties would confront the colonists, whether these were crop failures or Native American attacks, preachers would explain the problems as being a direct consequence of the community violating their covenant with God. The argument of the sermon would be that people had disappointed God and were being punished for it. The way to end that punishment would be to repent and change their ways. So any Jeremiah speech today has that same basic rhetorical structure, where speech notes all the ways that society is decaying. The speaker warns what will happen if the trend continues, and then outlines a new course of action that will put the people back in God's favor. In that malaise speech, which Carter gave in the summer of 1979, that's essentially what he was doing. He was warning that the American people had lost their confidence, that they had come to prioritize things instead of God and hard work, and that if they didn't change their ways, if they didn't pass his energy policies, they'd be heading down a road of self-interest that would lead to eventual ruin. I do think that the malaise speech is a large part of Carter's legacy and is something, as you say, that a lot of historians, a lot of people think of as being a bad part of that legacy. I always think about the Simpsons episode where, because of budget problems, they replaced the statue of Abraham Lincoln with one of Carter that had the caption "Malaise Forever" on it, as that's the defining phrase for his presidency, even though, of course, the word malaise isn't actually even in the speech. If this is the speech that bad, I would say yes and no. To some extent, I do find it personally inspiring. I think it's important for a president from time to time to remind the nation of the need to make some sacrifices for the greater good. Carter was warning about dangers of materialism and excessive consumption, and I think those are warnings we still need to hear and listen to today. But at the same time, I also find a lot to dislike about the speech. It does seem as if Carter was blaming the American people for the failures of his own policies. A lot of critics point out that he never mentioned that Americans had lost their confidence until his third year in office, when his own ratings had plummeted. At the same time, the connections between the psychological problems that Carter identifies, that he attributes to things like assassinations and Vietnam and Watergate, probably correctly so, the connections between those issues affecting America and the energy shortages were not always clear. As a columnist I quote said, "One person may spend the weekend in a dance club, another in a church. It's hard to tell which contributes more to the energy crisis." And I think there's a point to that as well.
Mm-hmm. You give George W. Bush great credit for his post-9/11 speeches, in which he called terrorists evil and enemies of freedom. But as good as those speeches were rhetorically, they didn't help him that much politically, did they?
In many ways, I was actually inspired to explore this topic by the presidency of George W. Bush. I remembered vividly his second inaugural address, where he made a coherent argument that the spread of freedom was both God's plan for man on earth, as well as the best possible way that America could ensure its own security. And I do think those were compelling speeches, indeed comforting speeches, where Bush, through his good versus evil rhetoric, had helped to assure people that there was still order to a world that looked increasingly disordered after the terrorist attacks. But did Bush's words help him maintain support for the war on terror? That's a claim I think that's harder to make. As I show in the book, opinion on the war on terror tracked developments abroad. As progress stalled in Iraq in 2004, 2005, 2006, the public turned against Bush, no matter how stridently he made the case that the war on terror was a battle between good and evil. Similarly, the media was sympathetic at first, but I code the reaction to his major addresses, and again we see a downward trend, so that by the second inaugural, the media is calling Bush's language a cheap political marketing device akin to a slogan for Pepsi. And though Bush got most of what he wanted from Congress as far as the war on terror goes, I don't think you can attribute that congressional success to Bush's language. Political scientists often talk about the two presidencies. In the domestic presidency, the president is often frustrated, and it takes huge congressional majorities and favorable conditions to get anything done. In the foreign policy presidency, however, the public and Congress look to the president for leadership, and he's more likely than not to prevail on issues where he is determined. So I fully believe the record in Congress would be the same if Bush didn't once mention God or good and evil in his speeches on the war on terror. He'd have had that success in Congress simply because he was commander-in-chief during a time of war.
How do you account for the observable fact that two of the most outwardly religious presidents in recent times, Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, were the least church-going of presidents? Jimmy Carter went every Sunday, and that didn't really seem to matter to his enemies.
Church attendance is an interesting issue, and you're right. Reagan didn't go to church, and he didn't institute private services in the White House either, like Nixon had. He rationalized his absence on Sundays using a patently phony excuse about not wanting to go to church because he didn't want to jeopardize the safety of other worshipers. Obviously, any time the president is in public, he is in some sense jeopardizing the safety of others. But yet Reagan was still well regarded by religious Americans. In contrast, right, Carter did go every Sunday. He was incredibly active in his religious practices, even taught Sunday school 14 times as president, but he was detested by a lot of religious Americans. And I think the lesson is that perceived responsiveness to a religious community is more important than actually being a fellow believer. So Reagan was perceived as being responsive to churchgoers, even if most of what he did for religious Americans was actually symbolic. Carter, on the other hand, was perceived as being unresponsive. He didn't try to overturn Roe v. Wade. He opposed tax breaks for parochial schools. He backed off a promise to hire evangelicals for his staff, and he resisted regular meetings with religious leaders. So I think as a result, it was discounted that he was actually a true evangelical and had more in common with religious Americans than perhaps Reagan did.
David O'Connell, assistant professor of political science at Dickinson College, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. His new book, his first book, God Wills It, Presidents and the Political Use of Religion, will be coming out this fall. David, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed it.
No, thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Over the years, overly broad legislation and activism by conservative judges have weakened our antitrust laws, says expert Sandeep Vaheesan, and the result is greater economic inequality. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Don't look now, but the overbearing power of America's military-industrial complex has probably snuck into your town. The multi-billion-dollar global armament giants have discovered a hot new growth market here at home, the militarization of police agencies. The people of Ferguson, Missouri learned about the domestic proliferation of battlefield firepower the hard way this summer when their own police department came after them with a Bearcat tank, 2 armored Humvees, stun grenades, M16 rifles, and other weapons of war. It's been widely reported that this push into combat gear and the militant mentality that accompanies it has largely come from a 1990 law authorizing the Pentagon to disperse surplus war equipment around the country. Less known, however, is that our corporate arms peddlers have leapt into direct sales, holding field demonstrations and trade shows to titillate the fancy of police chiefs and other officials. LRAD Corporation, for example, makes the long-range sound cannon that was used in Ferguson, literally blasting away demonstrators with ear-shattering pain. Also, such tear gas makers as CTS are having a field day supplying and resupplying police agencies. Then there's Taser International's electrocution gun, which can be heart-stopping, now on the hip of nearly everyone with a badge. In September, militarizers paraded their stuff at a Missouri shebang called Military Police Expo. LRAD, CTS, and Taser were there, along with a horde of other vendors, to schmooze and sell to a crowd of civilian law enforcement and chiefs of police who were invited to go on this military shopping spree. This is Jim Hightower saying a coalition of citizen groups are organizing to stop this pernicious sale of arms to be used against us citizens. For information, go to facingteargas.org. Facingteargas.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. The Reagan administration left behind a pro-monopoly business environment enforced by activist conservative judges that's helping to widen income inequality today. Antitrust expert Sandeep Vaheesan says Democrats share the blame. And we say hello to Sandeep Vaheesan, special counsel at the American Antitrust Institute and co-author with Lena Khan of an article that traces how 100 years after the trust-busting progressive presidencies, corporations now rule the country and make us uncompetitive and unequal. Sandeep Vaheesan, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me.
That's a pretty depressing start to an interview. I hate to lead you in that way, but we need to talk about this. You paint a pretty dismal picture of how in a century's time the antitrust laws and progressive regulation of predatory corporations have all but disappeared. How did that happen?
I guess I would say there are two principal reasons. The first is substantive. When Congress passed the antitrust laws, it used very general language. For example, the Sherman Act prohibits restraints of trade and monopolization. And similarly, the Federal Trade Commission Act prohibits unfair methods of competition. None of these terms are self-defining, so what that meant in practice was the courts have tremendous discretion over how the antitrust laws operate. When we have progressive courts, that can potentially be a very good thing, and we could have very aggressive antitrust enforcement. Unfortunately, when the court's composition changes and becomes more conservative, that can also be a very bad thing. And that's what we've seen over the past 30 to 40 years. With the rightward shift of the Supreme Court, the interpretation of the antitrust laws has changed radically. Since the late 70s, the court has said antitrust law is concerned with one and only one thing, economic efficiency. Other antitrust goals like open markets, competitive choice, innovation, those are all out the window. And on top of that, the court has assumed that big business behavior is generally beneficial for consumers, or even if it's harmful, it's quickly corrected by the market's mechanisms. And the corollary to this outlook is that government can only step in and ruin this beautiful self-regulating market. So as part of the broader rightward shift of the court, what we've seen is greatly weakened antitrust laws. And I would say the second principal reason is political. If you look at American history 100, 125 years ago, there was tremendous popular interest in antitrust. For example, in the 1880s and 1890s, there was even an anti-monopoly movement whereby farmers and workers came together to resist the growing power of corporations. But from our perspective today, that's almost a historical curiosity. Antitrust is mostly run by technocrats in government, and the antitrust conversation tends to be exclusively dominated by big businesses. And so as you can imagine, this creates very skewed incentives for enforcement. Even if a well-intentioned government enforcer wants to bring many cases, the incentives are completely misaligned. Aggressive enforcement likely means a backlash from big business, including complaints from Congress and other parts of the executive branch. Whereas there are no real consequences for weak enforcement. The public is too disengaged to really care if the antitrust laws are being enforced or not.
Well, now, this is something that has been, and this I'm referencing, if there's a sudden major backlash to this, obviously there's going to be pushback from the big corporations. But this is something that has been slowly chipped away at for many, many, many years. So is that the type of reaction? Is that how we fix this? Just kind of slowly take back what has been given away? I mean, what's the approach to this?
That's a great point. It has been a long-term change. None of this happened overnight. And I think the first step is creating more awareness of the economy around us, how we live in an economy and society with highly concentrated markets and everything from healthcare, airlines, telecommunications. Virtually every industry you can think of is dominated by 2 or 3 or 4 large corporations. So the first step is to inform the public that this is what's happened, and it's a serious problem. It costs us in terms of how much we pay for goods and services and how much we receive for our labor. And once we build awareness, we need to take that a step further and establish a popular constituency for antitrust that would put pressure on the government to challenge more mergers and stop monopolists from crushing their smaller rivals.
Absolutely. So the consequences, let's talk about the consequences of this growing power of corporations. What are they? And does this power explain, at least in part, the increased economic inequality in the U.S.?
Absolutely. I think economic concentration is an underrated contributor to inequality, and it works principally through two channels. More oligopolies and monopolies means we pay more for many goods and services, and some of the examples include how much we pay for healthcare, how much we pay for airline tickets, how much we pay for broadband service. The list goes on. And on the other hand, more powerful corporations can also depress the amount of pay we receive for our work. A good example is the farm sector, where we have huge agricultural processing companies like Tyson and Smithfield that have so much power that they can drive down what farmers receive for their chickens, livestock, and other produce. And from a political perspective, economic power frequently translates into political power. Huge businesses have an easy time organizing and lobbying politicians for advantageous policies that boost their bottom lines and cost the rest of us. And so I think both these mechanisms contribute to inequality. Higher prices and lower wages means that wealth is in effect transferred from ordinary Americans to the shareholders and executives of large corporations. And on top of that, corporations are promoting policies in the political space that advances their interests at the expense of the general public. Two good examples are reductions in the corporate tax rate and financial deregulation, both of which have happened over the past 3 decades.
We're speaking with Sandeep Vaheesan, special counsel at the American Antitrust Institute and co-author of an article with Lena Khan that traces the 100 years after or the corporations that now rule the country and make us uncompetitive and unequal. Let's talk. Who's to blame? Are there Democrats in Congress and on the courts that have allowed this to happen, and why? Or I mean, is it usually we talk about bipartisanship as being a good thing, but is there blame all the way around on this?
I think that's a fair assessment. There has been, to a large extent, a bipartisan consensus on this new antitrust outlook, whereby big business is effectively allowed to do as it pleases. That said, I would still place a lion's share of blame on Republican administrations, especially starting with Ronald Reagan in 1981. One interesting thing about antitrust is Congress has mostly not been involved in this area of law for the past 35, 40 years. It's passed a few small antitrust measures, but Congress has done nothing to change the fundamentals of antitrust, either for better or for worse, since the late 70s. And most Democrats in Congress have mostly acquiesced because they've been interested in other things. Over the years, there have been a few voices who've been tireless champions of antitrust. I can think of Senator Phil Hart from Michigan in the 60s and the 70s, who constantly championed more antitrust enforcement. Similarly, Senator Howard Metzenbaum from Ohio played a similar role in the 80s and 90s. And today we seem to be having a worthy successor in Senator Al Franken, who is a voice for more antitrust enforcement. And he's been especially vocal on opposing further media consolidation. And while Congress has been relatively dormant in this area, the courts have been very active, as I mentioned earlier. And unfortunately, some of the leading progressives on the court have adopted the economic outlook of their conservative peers. Several of the most notable antitrust decisions over the past 3 decades were written by liberals, including Justices Brennan and Marshall. And these are two justices who are seen as liberal lions, two of the most progressive justices to ever serve on the Supreme Court. But unfortunately, when it came to antitrust, they weren't nearly so progressive and often sided with their conservative counterparts. And if we have had one antitrust champion on the court over the past few decades, it was Justice John Paul Stevens. He was a leading pro-antitrust justice. But unfortunately, since he's left the court, it's not clear that he has a successor. Justice Stephen Breyer is certainly well-versed in antitrust and was an antitrust scholar before he became a judge. But his views on antitrust generally tend to be more centrist than Stevens.
Now, if corporations are doing better, doesn't that help the huge number of average Americans who hold stock-based retirement plans, or are retirement plans a thing of the past?
Retirement plans have certainly changed a lot. Previously, companies would promise workers pensions after they retired, and the company would provide most or all of that money. Today what we have is workers are given the option of contributing to their retirement plans on a favorable tax basis. And obviously with wage stagnation, many Americans just can't save enough to build up a retirement nest egg. But even if you factor in 401ks and IRAs of ordinary Americans, stock ownership is still mostly concentrated among the top 10% and especially 1% of the population. And interestingly, concentration of wealth, which includes things like financial investments, is even more concentrated than income. And that's one of the interesting facts that Thomas Piketty presents in his book. If we think income concentration is a problem, wealth concentration is an even more serious problem.
Now, what can we do to get economic power back from the corporations?
I think the first step is to realize none of this is inevitable. Our current predicament isn't purely the product of impersonal forces like technology and globalization. I think it's too convenient for defenders of the status quo to say, this is all inevitable, we can't do anything about it. But that's not true. I think we first have to push back on this conservative libertarian idea that markets just exist in a vacuum. They just arise spontaneously, and government shows up after the fact and mucks things up. In reality, government's the one that establishes the rules of the game and builds the physical and social infrastructure necessary for markets to exist, let alone thrive. And this is the idea Senator Elizabeth Warren captured a few years ago when she told successful businessmen, you did a lot, but you didn't earn this on your own. You relied on a functional state, highways, a court system to succeed in the marketplace. So government is a precondition for markets. And when the rules established by government are not serving the public interest, we have to realize that we can change them. And in the case of corporate power, it's apparent that the rules have failed. Concentrated markets are not inevitable. We have to recognize that weak antitrust enforcement, starting in the early 80s, has put us in this situation. And ultimately, as members of a democratic society, we have the power to demand our representatives change the rules of the marketplace and ensure that the market economy works for the average person.
Okay. Sandeep Vaheesan, Special Counsel at the American Antitrust Institute. Sandeep, we appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org, and we look forward to having you back again soon.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Jim.
Okay, this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Congressman Keith Ellison.
Members of Congress not here in Washington, D.C., but that does not mean they are not on the job. They're out there, at least many of them, either very busy with the re-election campaign or very busy serving their constituents, keeping on top of the issues of the day. Is where we find our good friend, Congressman Keith Ellison from Minnesota's 5th Congressional District. Hello, Congressman. How are you?
Hey, man. Right here, working hard, as you say.
On the job. Yeah.
All over it, man.
How's it? You got a good contest there going? You going to come back and join us here? How's it look for you?
Well, it's looking pretty decent for me. I mean, my last election, things came in pretty well. We got 75% of the vote, but really, it's not my election I'm that worried about. I'm more worried about people like Rick Nolan, who is a guy who is, really awesome progressive. But he's in a battle up there with the heir of a fortune from the Mills Fleet Farm, a guy named Stuart Mills, very, very rich guy who just dropped yet another $75K of his own money into the race, and so it's a battle. It's nip and tuck every single day. And but Rick is optimistic and he's fighting back.
Yeah, good. He's a good guy too. I really like him. How about Al Franken? Looking pretty good.
Yeah, well, we were up double digits a few weeks ago. Now we're into high single digits, according to the polls. We know things are going to narrow. They're going to close. But let me tell you, for the last year, we've been pounding the pavement. We got this massive ground game. Turnout, we're knocking every door. We're calling people. And so I'm feeling real good about it. We're up on the University of Minnesota campus. We are in, all the community neighborhoods. So, we got a ground game, and they can run all the nasty attack as they want. At the end of the day, we're talking to people at their own doors, and I think that's going to prevail.
We were talking about this a little bit earlier, Congressman. I don't understand. I mean, the Republican narrative is like this country is just in such horrible shape. Everything is bad, 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 bad. And, I just looked, Washington Post is reporting that the American people seem to buy this. I mean, 66% of Americans in the latest poll I saw, Rasmussen said, the country's going in the wrong direction. Only 27% think we're going in the right direction. Where's all this gloom and doom and pessimism coming from? And do you share it?
Well, here's what I can tell you, is that, actually the country is doing better compared to how it was doing in Republican hands. But
I'll say,
yeah. The right wing has done basic damage to the fortunes of working class people. So even though unemployment rates have more or less recovered from 2008, people have come back to work at lower wages, right? Mm-hmm. And so the problem is that, we have all these college graduates doing jobs that you don't need a college degree for, like working at McDonald's, But this is what we're fighting against. This is what Republicans are fighting for. They're the ones who want to cut taxes for the rich, deregulate the rich, not increase the minimum wage, not do anything for health care. So at the end of the day, it's not that people are saying, "Oh, I'm voting for the Republicans this time." They're simply not voting. And the people who are convinced that the rich don't have enough money and the poor have too much, they're pretty consistent in their voting patterns. Whereas our folks who are fighting for a fairer, greener, safer, better America for all, we sometimes are checked out, or we think we're mad at Obama over this one issue or that one, so we're not going to vote at all. And we think that's going to achieve anything other than solidifying Republican control. And I'm saying this because I've been knocking doors every day all last week, and a lot of people are voting, but some don't even really know there's an election, and others say, well, what about the NSA spying? I'm like, look, we're working on that right now, but you're not going to help it by helping the right wing, by checking out. We need you in the game, not on the sideline.
But, you're getting to something President Obama's been talking about lately. I know when he was out in Wisconsin a couple of days ago for Mary Burke running against Scott Walker, he said, Mary Burke's going to be the next governor of Wisconsin if folks get out and vote, right?
Right.
That's the key, isn't it? Really?
That is the key. And by the way, our superior numbers can overcome their superior dollars. I mean, they're dropping buckets of money all over the place. We can't really go dollar for dollar with these people. We do need to fund our own campaign, but the real thing is we got something they could never have, the best interest of the American people. So as long as we go out and talk to them, we can get them, but we need folks to pitch in and vote, man. And I can just tell you, getting out, campaigning on the doors, on the phones, does help, because I run into people every day who are like, oh, I wasn't sure I was going to vote this year. Mm-hmm. I'm like, well, and in Minnesota, we got Mark Dayton as our governor, won in a recount, and we got a Democratic legislature. And we have increased the minimum wage. We have gone to all-day kindergarten. We've frozen tuition at University of Minnesota system-wide. We've gotten rid of our $6.2 billion deficit. Now we got a $1.6 billion surplus. All this under the Democrats, and we're still fighting to get people to vote. I'm like, look, man, we got 170,000 more Minnesotans who have health care who never had it before. We're lowering medical inflation, and we're still begging people to exercise what people around the world are dying for, which is the right to vote.
Yeah, unbelievable. Congressman Keith Ellison on the line with us from Minnesota. He represents Minnesota's 5th Congressional District, of course. So, Congressman, I want to know, when you get up every morning these days, do you take your temperature right away, and are you afraid of catching Ebola?
No, I feel pretty good about my health prospects relative to Ebola. I think we should take it seriously, but we don't need to panic. In fact, panic is not going to help anyone or anything. I will tell you that Minneapolis, an area, has the highest population of Liberian Americans in the United States. We're very proud of that.
Yeah.
Yes, we're very proud of that. We're very proud of it. We have great neighbors who hail from Liberia, and there I've been at a number of memorial services with people who were saying that they lost 17 members of their family, 8 members of their family. Their parents died, their siblings died, and they just want the United States and the world community to go help arrest this evil disease before it spreads any further in their country. Right. So I do think that it's a very serious problem, and it is a potential problem for us too. But I think we're learning every single day. I mean, the thing about that guy Eric Duncan, Eric Michael Duncan in Dallas, he came in. He said he was from the Ebola hot zone, and he had a fever. And they gave him some aspirin and told him to go home. I mean, no, that's not going to happen anywhere in America
again. Right.
So I think that we've learned a lot. The nurses who treated him are pulling through. And so I think that we're going to be fine. But we still need to remember that there's literally hundreds of people dying in Liberia, Sierra Leone every day. And we need to be concerned about it. And we need to we don't need to panic, but we need to be aware that, we live in a globalized world where H1N1, SARS, Ebola are a plane ride away, and so we've got to have a stronger sense of public health. But panic will not help anything. And a travel ban, I'm 100% against that.
So when you come back, Congressman, just about a minute left here. What's your top priority? What would you like? If you had your druthers, right? What's the top priority you'd like to see the House act on when you come back to Washington?
Immigration reform. We got to pass immigration reform. We got to get it done. Let me tell you, we got a lot of people whose roots, they're Americans, but their roots are, in Latin America, and these folks have been protesting, doing vigils. They have been calling my office to try to help their loved ones, and we just need to get immigration reform. According to the Congressional Budget Office, it would improve our economy, it would push up our GDP.
Yep.
It would make our economy more healthy. We need to do that, but also let's increase the minimum wage. And I got a long list, Bill. These Republicans haven't been doing nothing. We've passed fewer bills than the 1947 do-nothing Congress. Now, it seems like Boehner's trying to top, historical records for inaction.
Yeah, bring back Harry Truman. Give him hell, Harry. Right?
Yeah, that'd be an improvement. The do-nothing Congress would be an improvement over what the Boehner Congress has been.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Can't wait to see you again back here, Congressman. Thanks so much.
My brother. See you later, Frank.
All right. Thanks so much for your time this morning, Congressman Keith Ellison. Nobody better.
That's all for AmericasDemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. David O'Connell, Sandeep Vaheesan, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For AmericasDemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate.